So it's now time to talk about inner classes, because the thing is, in Java, it's actually possible to nest a class inside another class. So what I'm going to do is start by outlining the 4 types of nested classes, and then we'll go through some examples. So the 4 types of nested classes that you can use in Java are static nested classes. We can use a non-static nested class, and we call that an inner class. We can use a local class. Now that's an inner class that's defined inside a scope block, which is usually a method, and also an anonymous class, which is a nested class without a class name. Now the static nested class is mainly used to associate a class with its outer class. So in terms of behavior, you can think of it as being identical to a top level class, but the difference is that it's packaged in its outer class rather than in the package. Now that really means that it cannot access the non-static methods or members of its outer class without first creating an instance of that class. So I know that sounds like a mouthful, but I think what we'll do is we'll start with a non-static nested class, or the inner class, because these are quite useful. And the reason that they're useful is it's when it doesn't make sense to refer to a class without its outer class. So the example is if we're actually modeling an engine, we might actually have a gearbox class and a gear class. So let's go ahead and actually create that to see how this actually works in practice. So I'm going to go and create a new class. I'm going to call the first one gearbox. And we're going to add a few things to the gearbox. We're going to have an array list for the gears, the number of gears, and also the gear number. So we'll create those fields. So private array list gear. We haven't created that class yet. We're going to do that. Gears. Private int max gears. And private int gear number. And we'll set that to 0. We'll create a constructor. And the only parameter is going to be the max gears. Like so. We'll set that to max gears to max gears. And then we'll also do a this dot gears equals new array list. So we'll just initialize it. So, but we also want to do gear neutral, EUTRAL, if I can spell it, gear neutral equals new gear 0.0.0, like so. And I think what I did there was I didn't actually specify the right level of Java for some reason. So to fix that, if you ever do get that problem, just right click this and go to open module settings. We want to make sure that we've got our project set to the right version. So if I change that to version 8, you can see diamonds were introduced in version 7. I have actually said that in an earlier video to make sure you're always using version 8 there, but do select that and that should fix that error. And what we need to do is we need to add the gear class, which will actually fix that shortly. So we're creating a new gear, as you can see there, and we're going to add that to the array. So this .gears.add neutral. So that's the base class, and what we'll actually do now is create an inner class. This is the inner class, which is sort of a class within a class. So to do that, making sure that you're actually in the public class definition. So we're in the final bracket in between any method, at the end of any method, but before the closing brace. That's where we can start typing. So we can type public class gear, just as you would normally do it. And then we can actually add some private fields, just as you would normally create a class. So int gear number, and let's say private double ratio. We can create a constructor, and you can see we were using a constructor in the gearbox constructor to create a new gear. So we'll do that. And the constructor will have 2 parameters, the gear number and the ratio, like so. That should fix that other error on the screen there now. And we'll just create a public method for drive speed, which will basically accept the number of revs as a parameter and multiply that by the ratio to get the drive speed. So to do that, so we normally do, we just actually create a method. So public double drive speed int revs. We could return revs multiplied by ratio. So there's a step, there's like a definition for an inner class. So it doesn't actually make sense to refer to a gear in this scenario, except when we're talking about a gearbox. So that's why we've modeled it like this. So the gear isn't something that sort of is useful in its own right. It's coupled with a gearbox that makes it useful. So that's the idea of using an inner class. As I said, when it doesn't make sense to refer to something except within the context. So in this case, it doesn't make sense to talk about gears unless it's within the context of a gearbox. And that's why we've modeled the gears using an inner class of the gearbox class. Now, instances of the gear class have got access to all the methods and fields of the outer gearbox class, even those marked as private. So notice that the use of this in the inner class refers to the inner class and not the outer one. So in other words, this.gear number, this is actually talking about this actual class here, the public class. So it's the inner class in other words, and it's not referring to gear number, that's in this one here, because that's actually in a different class. That's in the the top level class, the gearbox class. So keep that in mind that when you're using this, particularly with inner classes, that you're actually dealing with the class that you're currently in. In this case, we're talking about the gear class. And that probably brings up an interesting point here, but using the same variable name for two different things like this is confusing. And of course, the reason why it's confusing is that inside the gear, both this.gear number and gear number refer to the gear number of the gear and not the gearbox itself. So if you want to refer to the gearbox's gear number from an instance of the gear class, you have to use gearbox.this.gear number. So, where a variable or parameter name is the same one as the one that's in the outer class, it's said to shadow the declaration of the outer class or in the outer class. So here, gear number in the gear class, this one here, we can actually say that is shadowing gear number in the gearbox class, which is that one there. So that's not a good thing. So we're going to rename the gearbox variable to current gear to avoid confusion, and that's what I certainly recommend, because you're going to get into all sorts of problems otherwise. So what we're going to do is we're just going to right click that, refactor, rename. We'll actually change that to current gear, press enter. And that would actually make a lot more sense to do it that way, just to avoid any confusion, because obviously you want to make things as easy as possible when you're developing, and anything you can do to reduce the sort of confusion, particularly when you start dealing with inner classes, it's very, very important to do that. So make sure you do keep that in mind. Now the gear class itself is a member of Gearbox, and it must be created with an instance of it. And probably the best way to show you what I mean by that is actually to show you an example. So we'll go back to our main class and create it so you can understand how that works. So go back to main. We're going to write some code here. So we're going to start with typing gearbox. So gearbox, we'll say McLaren, it's a nice car, equals new gearbox, 6. So 6 gears in other words. Now to actually create a gear class, we have to use gearbox, box dot gear, like so. First equals McLaren dot new gear 1, the ratio 12.3. And then we could do something like system.out.println first dot drive speed, and we can set that to say 1000 revs, like so. So it's important to understand the declaration there, because gear is an inner class to gearbox. We need to specify it like that. We need to specify the outer class, gearbox dot, then gear, and then actually also here, you notice that line there, we actually used the gearbox instance that we created, and we did a dot new there for the gear. So it's slightly different syntax when you're creating an inner class like that than you've probably seen in code before. So keep that in mind, because it's very important. You'll actually get an error if you try to create a gear object without actually having an instance of gearbox to create it from. And just to show you what I mean by that, let's create a few more examples and you can sort of see what the weird errors you sort of get. So we've got the first one there, McLaren equals new gear. That one worked fine. But if we try typing gearbox dot gear second equals new gearbox dot gear, notice the syntax is different to 15.4, we actually get this weird little error here, and the error is com.timbercharcoal.gearbox is not an enclosing class. So you can't actually do it that way. You basically need to use the .new, but referencing the outer class first. As you saw in the example above, we created the outer class, which was gearbox, created a new instance of that, and then we used the .new on there to get that to work. So that doesn't work like that, but also you can't do this. You can't do gearbox gear third equals new McLaren dot gear 317.8. That also doesn't work. So you get an error that you can't resolve the symbol gear, and that's because, again, we need to use the .new to create a new instance of it like that. So keep that in mind, that you probably would think that, particularly with the third gear, that it would actually work like that, but that, as you can see in the attempt to create the third gear, might look how you'd expect it to look like, but it actually doesn't work as well. And again, just confirmation that in the case of the second gear, it actually fails with that error which you saw, which gearbox is not an enclosing class, which is slightly confusing. So if you look at that, you're probably thinking, well, why is it doing that? Because gearbox does seem to be an enclosing class in as much as the outer class for gear. For that call new to work, gear would have to be a static nested class. So just really a matter of getting used to the syntax. The bottom line here is that it goes out. This is the correct way to actually create the outer class, which you would normally do anyway. There's nothing new about that. But in terms of the inner class, you reference the outer class first, dot, then whatever the name of the inner class is, and then that's for declaration purposes, and when you're actually initializing it, the name of the object you've created, dot new, then whatever the name of the inner class is, and then the normal parameters you would have in a constructor. And so if we just run that to see that it's actually working. Okay, and you can see that I've actually got some errors there. I'm not too good at picking up typos when I'm actually recording videos. Okay, now if we actually run it, now that I've actually fixed that other little typo, we should actually find that it works and it comes up as you would expect it to. So bottom line is that the correct syntax might be a bit clunky, but that's just how it's done. That's how the designers of Java have implemented this, and we obviously have to work with that. The other thing to keep in mind is that often though, the inner class is going to be private anyway. So in other words, instances will only be created by the outer class. So in other words, you wouldn't normally, if you've got a gearbox here where it's the outer class, the inner class is probably, in this case gear, is probably something you don't want people to normally directly access anyway. So in other words, the instances will only be created by the outer class. The private, so making this class gear private makes sense here because we're not actually interested in the individual gear objects when driving. We want to change the gear, but we do that by interacting with the gearbox, not with the individual gears. So in other words, your public interface that you're exposing to your program here would be gearbox. You wouldn't be exposing gear directly. You'd be exposing the fact that you can actually change gears, but not actually, you won't be interacting with the gears itself, if that makes sense. So what we could actually do is actually make some changes to that. So that's actually how it would actually work. And you saw going back to the gearbox class anyway, let's close that down, that we did actually create a new gear anyway. In the constructor, we added a new gear for neutral anyway by default, and that's how we could access that. So if we actually change this now and change it so this is actually a private class, the inner class is now private, as you can see there. We've still got a constructor and the ratio, but we don't need to make any other changes to it. But that will mean, if you come back to here, we actually get errors now, and that's because we can't access that directly anymore, but we'll need to make some changes to the gearbox to actually do that. So what we're going to do is actually add a few functions. We're going to add a function for operating the clutch. We're going to add a method rather to actually add gears. So we can actually add gears to our gearbox object, which will be adding gears to the array list automatically, and just show you how to change gear as well, all done from the outer class, in this case gearbox. So this is going to be above the declaration for the private class gear now. So we'll start off by operating clutch, public void operate clutch, and we'll boolean in, as you can see there. And I haven't created that variable yet, but we'll do that shortly. So clutch is in equals in, whatever the status of that is. And we'll create a boolean here. So it'll be private boolean clutch is in, like so. So that's the ability to operate the clutch as a method. We'll also add the other method, which is the ability to add gears to our gearbox. So public void add gear, and we'll pass a number, which will be the gear number, and the ratio, which you saw us using before. Then we'll just do some basic checking here. We'll put if number is greater than 0 and number is less than or equal to max gears. Max gears was something we defined up above. Max gears, if that's the case, this .gears.add, creating a new gear class, which remember is now private, so only the outer class, the gearbox class, can directly talk with it now, and the number will be the gear number and also the ratio. So that's the add gear method. And then the other thing we want to do is we want the ability to change the gear as well, and to do that we use a change gear. We'll create a change gear method. So public void change gear into new gear. Then we want to make sure that it's valid. So we're going to put if new gear is greater than or equal to 0, remembering it can be 0 if it's neutral, and new gear is less than gears.size. So we're just validating that we actually have got a gear of that number. That's the case. And also check if the clutch is in, assuming it's a manual. So if this dot clutch is in, if all that is true, we can go this dot current gear is equal to new gear. We can do something, we'll put just a message out to say gear plus new gear selected. Else, what we're going to do is print out a message grind, which would basically mean that there's a problem with you trying to change the gears and you're getting that weird sound you get from a manual when you try and do that. And we'll set this .current gear to 0 because we weren't successful in actually setting or changing the gear essentially. And what we'll also do is we'll actually add a wheel speed method as well to determine the speed. So we're going to create one, public double wheel speed, and the parameter will be revs. If clutch is in, scream, like so, and we'll return 0.0. So we're not returning any calculation at this point in time. Otherwise, if the clutch isn't in other words, the car can move, we're going to return revs times gears.get current gear dot get ratio. And what we haven't done is we haven't actually exposed the get ratio. So we need to do that. That's a method of the inner class. So we're just going to, and that's just a getter. So we're going to do a getter for our ratio like so, and that should fix that other error up. So you can see how now we've written the class, the gearbox class, to do all the, to perform all the functionality it needs in the gear class itself. We're creating new instances of the gear and saving it in our array list up here. But we're also using various functions within the gear to get the ratio and for other sorts of calculations. And in this case here, you can see in the wheel speed, if the clutch is in, obviously we're not actually moving. There's going to be a problem. So we're screaming, returning 0. Otherwise though, it's the revs multiplied by the gear, the current gear that we've actually set in the change gear method. And then we're using the dot ratio, which is actually called from the inner class itself. So that's how you'd actually go about doing it. So what I'm going to do, this video is getting a bit long. I'm going to stop here. And in the next video, we'll come back and we'll actually put some of this code into the main method and start seeing how this actually works. So I'll see you in that next video.